Okay guys, so in this video I wanted to talk about the epidermis. And just a part of the epidermis, not all of the strata in the epidermis, just two of them. So to start, let's talk about what the epidermis is. So your skin, right? Your skin is actually composed of several things, and its outermost layer is the epidermis, okay? So if this is your outside, right here would be your epidermis, right at the surface. Okay. So let's say that we just zoom in on the epidermis, and we look at the different strata in your epidermis. And your epidermis is actually composed of things called strata. Strata. Okay? And there are lots of them. Well, for example, there's the stratum basale. And that's the first stratum we want to talk about. Okay? It's actually your lowest one. So we're going to be talking about our two lower ones. Okay? I won't talk about the second one quite yet, but just know that we're going to be talking about this stratum basale first. Okay? And it's the first stratum that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so this is your stratum basale. So what is it composed of? Well, it's actually composed of basal cells. Okay. Right, draw 4 of them. And these basal cells, are actually going to produce keratinocytes. So keratinocytes. How are they going to produce keratinocytes? We'll talk more about keratinocytes later. They're going to produce keratinocytes. Just keratinocytes. Okay. And they're going to do that via mitosis. So these basal cells are going to mitose, right? And when they mitose, there are going to be cells produced, basal cells produced, as well as keratinocytes. So when a basal cell mitoses, the result can be an additional basal cell or another cell that can differentiate into a keratinocyte. All right? And we'll talk more about keratinocytes in a second. Just know that basal cells give rise to keratinocytes via mitosis. They don't only produce keratinocytes via mitosis, they also produce more of themselves via mitosis. But they do both. They produce themselves, and they also produce cells that can differentiate into keratinocytes. Okay, moving on. The next thing that I want to talk about is called a Merkel's cell. So Merkel's cells. Merkel's cells. Okay? And I'll draw it like a circle. And these will actually have afferent nerves. So, and they're going to help detect light touch. Okay? So something like just resting your fingertips on a table or something like that. Just light touch. Yeah, so those are Merkel cells. Next, I want to talk about something called a melanocyte. Okay, melanocyte. Draw it. Whoa. Melanocyte. Okay. Actually. Kind of like finger-shaped things. and I'll explain why they're present in a second, their function. But just know that these are melanocytes, and they produce melanin. They produce and distribute melanin. So these are melanocytes here, and they produce and distribute melanin. Now, melanin blocks some UV rays, so you need to wear a UV ray barrier. Now let's look at a bigger picture of a melanocyte. So So this is our melanocyte, right? Just bigger now. And its Golgi apparatus is actually going to give rise, so Golgi, to melanosomes. Okay? And these melanosomes, they're going to start out as pre-melanosomes. So at first, they're just pre-melanosomes. So when they're near the Golgi, they're just pre-melanosomes. And something is going to occur in these pre-melanosomes that I want to talk about. So let's draw one pre-melanosome. Or actually, let's just draw one melanosome. So this is a melanosome right here. Okay? Yeah. And it's actually going to have a process occurring in it. So it's going to have tyrosine being converted to something called, I'll just write the acronym, and you know what, I'll write the full word too. 3,4 dihydroxy phenyl alanine. So alanine. Okay. That's the full word, but this is just the acronym. So I'll just be writing that. So what's going to happen to this? Well, it's actually going to be converted into melanin. And you can see melanin is being produced inside these melanosomes. Okay? In these pre-melanosomes, this process is just starting, right? And there's something that we need to note also. Tyrosinase is an enzyme involved in the tyrosine to 3,4 dihydroxyphenylalanine, right? So tyrosinase is required. And I'm just noting that right now because that's going to be important in a second. So anyways, these pre-melanosomes are going to produce melanin inside them, right? And as they get further and further out to the ends of these finger-like areas, actually they're called processes. So they're called like processes. You can call them processes. And when they reach the end, they'll be mature melanocytes. These are mature melanocytes once they've reached the end. And once they've reached the end, they're actually ready to enter a new cell. So that's the distribution of melanin. So let's draw another cell here. So maybe it's a keratinocyte, like we talked about earlier. Okay, it's a keratinocyte, and it wants to receive some melanin because it needs some shielding from UV rays. So what's going to happen is, actually, I'll just draw this a little bit bigger, just so that they're touching, or they're near each other, very close to each other. Okay, so now they're near each other. What's going to happen is these melanosomes, right, they're going to be able to enter the keratinocyte, right? And once they've entered the keratinocyte, well, that's good, right? Because then the keratinocyte will have melanin. And this is actually going to happen with the keratinocyte actually phagocytosing the end of this process, right? So one of these processes. So how is that going to look, right? So I'll draw it out. Let's take a zoom in picture. This is the end of it, and this is the keratinocyte. First, it's going to look like this, and then it will look like this. Actually, I'll just use the same picture, and eventually, this is sort of going to take in the end of this process, right? And then it's going to close off, right? So it'll look like that, and these melanosomes will still be there, and then finally, we'll have fully consumed the end. So it'll look like this. And it'll be in here, and now it will have a fully phagocytosed. It will have fully phagocytosed the end of this part of the melanocyte, right? So that's how it takes in these melanosomes. So that's how it takes in these melanosomes. And this phagocytosed part of the melanocyte will be able to release these melanosomes into the keratinocyte. And now the keratinocyte has melanin. Okay, so that pretty much concludes the whole part with how melanocytes produce melanosomes and how they distribute them as well, right? So let's move on and talk about the next. Well, let's go back and talk about keratinocytes. So let's make some room because we're going to be talking about what keratinocytes do. Okay, so what do keratinocytes do? Well, keratinocytes, you might have guessed already, but keratinocytes produce cytokeratin. Cytokeratin. And it's also known as just keratin. So keratin. And keratin is a protein. So it's produced like any other protein. And we've talked about that before. Yeah, so we won't be going into too much detail about it. But we have cytokeratin. And what's going to happen to that cytokeratin? Well, it's actually going to form eventually form keratin filaments. Filaments. Whoa. Filaments. More commonly known as a tonofilament. So tonofilaments, more commonly known tonofilaments. Okay, so yeah. As more keratinocytes are produced, the top keratinocytes will move up through the epidermis, and yeah. So now I think we're ready to talk about the stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum, actually I'll write it a little bit higher up. Stratum spinosum, because I want some more space. So stratum spinosum. These are right beside each other. I'm just drawing it higher up because I want more drawing space. So these keratinocytes make up a large portion of it. All keratinocytes. Oh, and by the way, these processes will reach up into the stratum spinosum, but I won't draw them just for simplicity's sake and to make it easier to draw. So anyways, we're going to have these keratinocytes. And once they're in the spinosum, they're actually going to be, these keratin filaments will actually be turning into tonofibrils. So these tonofilaments will become tonofibrils. They'll come together to form tonofibrils. And what are tonofibrils going to do? Well, after these tonofilaments have bundled together sort of to form these tonofibrils, they're actually going to help anchor desmosomes, something called desmosomes, to the cell membrane. So yeah, so they basically help make sure that the desmosomes are anchored to the cell membrane in keratinocytes. And we'll talk about desmosomes in a sec. Yeah. But yeah, that's pretty much the gist of tonofibrils that are basically just bundles of tonofilaments. And desmosomes are actually something that are important in maintaining the structure. So stratum spinosum, in the stratum spinosum, you'll see that there will be little desmosomes between all of these cells, all of these keratinocytes. Okay, and these desmosomes are basically little parts that hold everything together, and they're also present in your stratum basale between all of these. The only thing that it doesn't actually help attach to are your melanocytes, or it doesn't actually attach to your melanocytes, not exclusively. Okay, yeah, but it will be basically your desmosomes will be between your keratinocytes and your basal cells and your Merkel cells. Okay, so what else is in your stratum spinosum? So we've gone over that. Well, Langerhans cells will be in your stratum spinosum. Langerhans cells. Okay. And Langerhans cells are actually part of your immune system. And basically they function, I won't go in detail because they're part of the immune system, but they function to basically, actually, they're most prominent in your stratum spinosum. That's why I'm doing them over here. They're actually they're actually present in your entire epidermis. But anyways, what do these Langerhans cells do? Well, they actually are antigen-presenting cells. So if they find an antigen that's being expressed somewhere, they'll express that antigen themselves. They'll go over to the nearest local lymph node, and they'll actually help create an adaptive response. So, which we'll go over in the future. So, these Langerhans cells are going to be part of your immune system. Another thing to mention is that near the top of the stratum spinosum, as these keratinocytes become near the top area of the stratum spinosum, they will actually begin to produce keratohyalin granules. And these keratohyalin granules we'll talk about in the future because they're more important in other strata of the epidermis. And when these keratohyalin granules are actually being produced, lamellar bodies are also being produced, but we're going to be talking about that more in the next video because they actually function in the strata after the stratum spinosum. But they start being produced in the stratum spinosum. I should also mention that the actual process that happens here in the melanocytes tyrosine to this tyrosinase here. Oh, right, and this goes to melanin. Something important is to note is that the melanin production in these melanocytes can actually be controlled by a hormone called MSH. So MSH. So it's regulated, melanin is regulated, melanin production is regulated by MSH. The full name is melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, yeah. And this melanocyte stimulating hormone is actually going to bind to a protein. Oh, not there. Is actually going to bind to a protein on the melanocyte surface called MC1R. That's the acronym. And the full word is melanocortin 1 receptor. So melanocortin 1. There's no dash usually. I just had to put a dash here because there wasn't enough room. Receptor. Okay. And once it binds to this, that will trigger tyrosinase to increase, its production will increase. And when that happens, melanin production will also go up. Okay. So that pretty much concludes this. So just to recap, your stratum basale has basal cells, Merkel cells, melanocytes, and these basal cells produce keratinocytes, which will move up because of the keratinocytes being produced at the bottom here. And as they move up, they'll become part of the stratum spinosum. In the stratum spinosum, these keratin filaments, or these tonofilaments, will begin bundling together to form tonofibrils. These tonofibrils will help anchor these desmosomes. And Langerhans cells are basically immune cells, and we didn't go too in depth into them this video because they're part of the immune system. But that pretty much concludes this video. Thank you.